chapter one of the book goes through an introduction to kind of the field of human geography. And one of the things that you'll notice in this class is there is a huge amount of vocabulary, and really what you're learning is the vocabulary and the terms and the concepts that are used in this discipline or in the discipline of geography. So we're also looking at the ways geographers study human geography, or the spatial arrangement of human activity and behavior. So one of the things I want you to do is to not just learn the definitions for these terms and concepts, but be able to reflect them back in your discussions. So these are the terms that you're going to be using as you work through your activities and your lessons. And unfortunately, or fortunately, this really does require some rote memorization. This is a survey class, and this is a fairly common approach for learning the discipline of a new vocabulary, or the vocabulary of a new discipline. So when I show you this picture, this is a young man who was born in Seoul, Korea, and I do this in my face-to-face classes, and we have a discussion about what kind of traits or cultural traits you might expect this person to have. And so people say things like he might speak with an accent, or he might enjoy rice or kimchi, and it really brings us to the definition of what is culture. And culture is not the inherited traits. Culture is the learned behaviors. And I know this because this is actually my younger brother, who was adopted from Korea when he was about 3 months old. And so he has no accent. He doesn't like rice. There's nothing about him that doesn't look, other than his physical characteristics. His behavior is totally 100% American-born American. And so that's one of the things we have to really think about when we study culture, is we're really exploring the ways people have adapted their environment or have learned to live in an environment. And cultural geography is a part of this huge geography discipline that goes from the physical realm, natural environment, physical geography, geomorphology, hydrology, through to the other end of the continuum, which is cultural geography. And so cultural geography looks at economics, landscapes, all kinds of aspects of human environment. So when we look at this map, and maps are one of the important tools of geographers, we're looking at a map showing countries in Africa that have a high percentage of hunger and food insecurity. And so this has been an ongoing problem in developed or modern Africa. And so we can look at this map and say, well, these are areas that need some kind of help with food insecurity. And so one of the things that people did is they looked at a map of wheat producing areas in the world, and they thought, well, we can adapt the environment in these areas in Africa, and we can bring in fertilizers, chemicals, water, irrigation, so that some of the areas in Africa that are experiencing hunger issues can grow wheat. And really what they found is, even when they technologically adapted that, human behavior did not accept wheat. It wasn't part of their culture. It wasn't part of how people in some areas thought about food, and so it was not always successful. One of the major concepts in cultural geography is this idea of regions, and so the book brings up 3 different types of regions: formal regions, functional regions, and vernacular regions. And I will ask you how to compare, or I will ask you to compare and contrast these. What are evidence of each kind of region? And formal regions are often developed around a trait. So it might be language, it might be religion, it might be language and religion. So you can have multiple traits that identify a certain region. So when I look through this map of prevailing religions, these are formal regions of the world. And the interesting thing about cultural regions is the boundaries that we set for cultural regions are really not hard and fast. So if I look at the northern area of Africa, I see that this is an Islamic region. But just because I move from a country that's colored green to a country that's colored purple, doesn't mean I will not run into any other people that are Islamic. So what informal regions, what you have are a core and a periphery situation. So make sure you read through that in the text. Also, that these boundaries are fluid, they're not hard and fast. Here's another formal vegetation regions. And just because I have extreme desert in the north doesn't mean that as soon as I cross that line, I don't see areas of extreme desert anymore. So these are just generalizations that humans create in order to discuss, to talk about, and to study areas. Another type of region is a functional region. Now, functional regions do have hard and fast borders. So the difference between, or the line between the United States and Canada is an absolute line that's been drawn on maps and that's been agreed upon by both governments. And I can absolutely be in the United States or immediately in Canada, depending on which side of the line I'm on. Functional regions are usually developed for some type of organizational purpose, so for some function. And as such, they also tend to have what's called a node, or an area where major decisions are made. So if we look at the scale, continental or the country scale, the United States and Canada, Mexico are all three functional regions, and the nodes would be Mexico City, Washington, D.C., and Ottawa. These are the areas where decisions are made. And so this is another functional map showing federal court areas. So again, if I commit a crime in Utah, I have to go to the courts that are being served by that federal border. If I commit a crime in Nevada, I'm going to go to the areas that are functionally served by Nevada, or by this Area 9. The book also looks at, on a smaller scale, how you can have functional regions based in small areas of land where the farm would be the node, and the land divisions or the ownerships are developed for a function. The third type of region is vernacular region, and these are regions where people choose to participate. So in the Willamette Valley, we have kind of the duck and the beaver vernacular or association. In Southern Oregon, there is a vernacular region, or Southern Oregon and Northern California, called the State of Jefferson, where there's kind of a movement to, or had been a movement to secede from the Union and create their own state. I guess secede from both states. So with vernacular regions, these are self-identified, not like a functional region where these are given. Again, the borders are less defined. So here we're looking at places that consider themselves as being in Dixie. And in Florida, you see Florida is kind of not considered in the heart of Dixie, although there are pockets that would identify themselves as the vernacular of Dixie. The other big idea in this text is the idea of diffusion. And diffusion is the spread of innovation and ideas and people or cultural behaviors from one point to other areas. And so we can look at this idea of technology diffusion and movement. There are several types of diffusion, and you'll need to know all of these and how they differentiate from one another. Contagion diffusion is this idea where the term is an original knower. So let's say I know some technology, and I teach my neighbors or the people in close contact to me. So it's almost like the movement of a cold from one place to another, and the expansion or the diffusion of the idea happens outward. Hierarchical diffusion is shown on the right of this image, and this shows kind of a skipping pattern where the knower might be a city like Paris, if we talk about fashion, and it would skip all of the small towns and move to other big towns, and eventually then it would move into mid-sized towns and into small towns. So hierarchical diffusion is kind of the expansion of an idea, but definitely skips areas. And then the third type of diffusion is relocation diffusion, and this is does not typically end up in a lot of ideas moving out, but it's where the person actually moves and brings their culture with them. So these three people on the left might move from the United States to Spain and take their language and their culture with them, but the Spanish people around them are not picking up the new language. So make sure you understand the idea of diffusion. And so, I'm not sure we're going to see dresses like this in Eugene, Oregon ever, but you might in New York. I don't know. Another kind of contagion diffusion is this idea of fads, and the hula hoops are a great example of when everybody, I got a hula hoop and everybody next door to me ended up with a hula hoop, and it was just almost like an explosion. Stimulus diffusion is a little bit different in that the idea is copied, but the exact innovation is not replicated. So here is a mandolin, and the stimulus idea of this was an armadillo. And so in stimulus diffusion, things are somewhat adapted. And then relocation diffusion, again, the number of knowers is not increased. It's just the behavior gets moved from one place to the other. When you look at diffusion, there's kind of a curve for looking at the stages of acceptance. And basically, typically, unless it's a fad, diffusion starts out with few people on the left-hand side of this curve, or on the 0, 0, 0 axis down here. Very few people are practicing the idea. It moves up quickly, and then you see a huge expansion, so a climb, a great increase, and then leveling off. So that's called a time distance decay. So the longer the time that the diffusion has been, or the idea has been in place, the fewer people are accepting it. And that could be because everybody already has an iPhone. Here's an example of hierarchical diffusion, where the printing press was innovated in 1456, and that's the place by the arrow. And you'll see that it skipped around. So it went from large cities, then infilled to the medium cities, and then printing press wasn't seen by the smaller cities until much later. There are also barriers to diffusion. So there are absorbing barriers that completely stop diffusion, and permeable barriers that let some diffusion through, but change it in a way. The book will talk about cultural ecology, looking at the differences between human and how we use the environment, and also just our perceptions, and different cultures have different cultural perceptions. We talk about cultural strategies. So here are some examples of homes in different areas but using similar technologies. The book goes through cultural landscapes and how we adapt our landscape and our environment, the different ways that we build and the tools that we use. We will also talk about how cities are developed. What is the structure of cities? Why does a Latin city have a circular pattern, and cities in the U.S. tend to have a grid pattern in the western U.S.? We'll talk about the buildings, how we use the land. Then we'll also talk a little bit about land division. And so there's a link in the reading, or in the assignments, of how we can go from these grid patterns, the PLSS system, to the meets and bounds, to the English, or to the French long lot. So we'll look at the different ways we divide up our landscape. And so here's some aerial photos of the grid pattern in Minnesota, to the circular irrigation in Kansas, to this long lot area in France. So we'll look at all of those. And then finally, we'll talk about location in two ways: is absolute location as opposed to relative location. An absolute location is a fixed address or coordinate. So Salem has this address, and it will work anywhere But we can also talk about Salem in relationship to other areas. So 60 miles north of Eugene, but that could also be 30 miles south of Portland. So relative location is not fixed, and absolute location is.